Good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, though I think you all do, my name is Molly Kostelecki. I'm the Assistant Finance Director with the city, and I'm one of the project managers for the HATS project. We are nearing the end of our procurement process for our new ERP software, and with that, we've finally gotten into the contract negotiation phase of that, and we'll be working through finalizing the scope of work and different things throughout that negotiation process, and we hope to begin implementation in early January. But in the meantime, we have some other work to do to prepare this organization for a change in technology as well as a change in process. And that change is really what we call change management, and to develop a change management program. So today I am pleased to introduce Dave Melby, who is the Consulting Solutions Manager for GFOA. GFOA has served as our partner throughout the procurement process. And Dave has, I'm going to read this, Dave has been working on ERP projects for over 20 years and is the primary author of the GFOA's change management methodology. He has assisted dozens of governments in preparing for ERP implementations through change management strategy and communications development, establishing project governance structure, and training staff on change management concepts and tasks. He's here today to provide our team with a brief overview of these concepts and to talk specifically about change management activities and resistance management. Our goal is to understand these ideas and then incorporate them into our implementation plan. Please join me in welcoming Dave Melby.
And it's a pleasure to be back in Colorado. I love coming out here and talking about my favorite topic with ERP, which is change management. And what we're going to do for the next couple of hours is go through some additional details from the last time that I spoke with you. I'm going to take a little bit of time to kind of recap some of the concepts that we've talked about already with change management, just to kind of get everyone oriented and on the same page. And then we're going to go into the building blocks of a good change management program, talk about resistance management, how to overcome those things, and give you some real specific steps that you can follow as you go through the implementation phase of the project. So when we talk about a recap, I'm going to go over concepts and then the framework that I gave you earlier this year and the overall approach to change management. But I really want to get today more specific about how that fits into the implementation phases that you're going to go through starting presumably in January, and how change management fits into implementation. And again, more specifically, what sorts of things are you going to see in terms of user resistance, and then what can you do to try to overcome that? So let's start with some of our important concepts in change management. The first thing to keep in mind with change management is that it's not a one-time event. Change management is not just a task on the implementation plan that says do change management. It's a process that lasts prior to implementation, all the way through implementation, and even into post-implementation support and beyond. So it's not something that you're going to do just once. It's something that's an ongoing activity throughout the project. So keep that in mind, that it's a long haul, just like the design and configuration of the software will take several months. So will change management. Second thing to keep in mind is that change management has to be planned. It is not something that you want to try to do on an ad hoc basis and just kind of deal with communication needs as they arise. Change management works much better if you have an actual communication plan laid out that's integrated with the implementation plan from the vendor, with specific communication activities that you're executing throughout the implementation, and specific points where you can have user engagement, where you can bring that wider user community into your project, let them see what you're doing and why. So if you have that plan, change management will be a lot more successful than if you simply try to kind of make it up as you go along. Change, as we know, is difficult, and it can be extremely difficult for people and less difficult for others. So it's important to kind of understand why change looks so hard to some of the people that you're going to be working with. And these would be people that are not only on the project team, but their user community as well. So one of the first things you might see, and think about your own departments and work groups and some of the users that you're going to come in contact with as we go through this, and see if some of these things don't stand out for you. First of all, for a lot of people, change is difficult because they simply don't see the problem the same way you do. And that can take a couple of different forms. You may see horrific inefficiency in some accounting process around the city. Other people may look at that and say, it's just fine, I don't know what you're talking about. They literally don't see the problem the same way you do. Other people might see the issue, but they think it's not because of systems or processes. They may think it's something else. Maybe it's because of some antiquated policy that needs to be jettisoned in their minds. They might even think it's because of the people. Like if we just had different people involved, this wouldn't be a problem. So they might see the issue with you, but think it has absolutely nothing to do with business process or software. So for these people, it's very difficult for them to kind of get what you're talking about when you say that there are issues that we need to fix and that this project is all about fixing those. Second thing you might run into is what we call change ambivalence, which is kind of the notion that I don't really know what that change is going to look like, so it's hard for me to embrace it. And this is going to be true really throughout the implementation. Until you really go live, it's hard to know for a lot of users exactly what's going to happen. We can talk about what the impact of the software will be. We can look at the forms, we can look at the screens, we can do training. But until they actually get in there and do it, it's very hard for users and even project team members to kind of understand what the impact is going to be. So it's until I have that, it's hard for me to really embrace that and say, yeah, I'm all for it, because I don't know what the it is. So for a lot of people, they're just kind of dealing with that. Until you can paint the picture, they're going to have some struggles with making process changes and changing systems. For those folks, and you'll hear this sometimes, they'll literally say, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. They'd rather deal with a system and a set of business processes that aren't very efficient, that don't help them get their jobs done, because at least they know it. At least they know how to work with it. And what you're presenting to them is going to be something that they don't know. So that will look, for some people, more difficult than simply dealing with the current system. Of course, one of the biggest things, and I think we're all aware of this when it comes to difficulty with change, is simply that old habits die hard. And things that we've been doing for 5 years, 10 years are very difficult to shake loose. And for most governments, when they're in this phase of an ERP project, they've been dealing with their current systems for more like 15 years or 20 years. Processes have not changed. I will sometimes go into a government and find procedure documents that are dated 1982. And so these are things that have been around for a long, long time. And the longer that those processes have been in place, the more ingrained they are in people's behavior. So it's very, very difficult to shake that loose, especially when it's kind of gone onto automatic pilot and people know exactly how to do their jobs. I know when I was in Milwaukee and we were doing our ERP project, I was observing one of the accounts payable clerks, and I was amazed at how she could process vendor invoices, be on the phone with her daughter about some family emergency, and do email all at the same time. And the reason she was able to do that is that that business process was so automatic and so ingrained that she didn't even have to think about it. And so now think about how much work it takes to extract that old way of doing things and implement something new. It's very, very difficult to shake loose those old habits. So how do we do that? One of the things that we have to continue to do is repeat these messages over and over and over again. So we talk a lot about business drivers, we talk a lot about project goals, and I'll touch on those in a few minutes. But one of the things of adult learning, and I think we all know this too, is we have to repeat things many, many times. And studies have shown that someone really needs to hear something 6 or 7 times before they can actually make it part of their daily routine, if you will. So when we talk about communication, what I'm going to be suggesting to you is that it's not enough just to go out there once and say, hey, this is how the process is going to change, this is how it'll impact you. That's a message that you need to send over and over and over again, because you need to in order to overcome those old ways of doing things. So it's important to keep that in mind. You're not going to be doing change management once or sending a message once. You're going to be sending it many, many times in order to overcome those old habits. Right, for a lot of people, change is like motherhood and apple pie. Of course, everyone's in favor of it. One of the things I used to do in change management is I would do a survey and I would ask people, are you ready for change? Do you believe change is a good thing? And inevitably, even in governments of 10,000 employees, I would literally get a 100% response. Yes, Dave, I am ready for change. I can do this, I'm ready to go, sign me up. Because it's something that everyone, of course, is in favor of. And it's easy at this point of the project where you are now going into contract negotiations. It's very easy to look at change because it's an abstract concept. It isn't something that you've had to really think about in concrete terms and assess what it means for your department, your work group, your division, or the city as a whole, right? We just haven't gotten to that point yet. So it's just a theory. And in theory, everyone's in favor of change. And then the very first time that you guys sit down to the table to go over a potential process change, then when change becomes real, that is where we find out just where all the resistance is, okay? And I have stories upon stories of project teams that have been anxious for change until the first meeting where they actually have to do it. So for a lot of people, where they have difficulty and why change is hard is just shifting from this theoretical change concept to something that's more concrete. Very, very difficult thing to do. And I think you'll find within the project team here, it will also be difficult to do. Not impossible to overcome, but something that's going to be tough. For other people, change is difficult because they simply don't know where to start. If you think about an ERP project, the scope of the project is ginormous, to use a technical term that my kids like to use. And it's covering all of the financial functions, accounting functions, all of HR payroll, a bunch of other ancillary functions to that. That's the daily bread and butter of government that's being affected by this project. So it's a big scope that's being tackled with this ERP system. And when you really step back and look at it, it can be very difficult for people to say, wow, where do we start? How do we even begin to make changes here to take advantage of new technology, become more efficient? Do we start here? Do we start with HR? Do we start with accounting? Do we start with financial reporting? Do we start with transaction process? Where do we go? And this happens a lot, I've noticed, with some of the executives, project sponsors, division directors, department directors that have a big picture view because that's their job, is to have a big picture view. And they can really struggle with, wow, how are we going to pull this off? You know, why is it going to take 2 years? And how is this whole thing going to go? So it can be really hard just to think about where to start. And for these people that are in that boat, very often they will simply become overwhelmed with the scope of the project, and they will tend to not start at all because they don't know where to go. So these are people that need to kind of be brought back down to earth, if you will, and focus on, let's talk about the first set of design needs and take them through the implementation plan. And this right here is why we integrate change management with implementation, is to make sure that we don't get lost in the grand scope of the project and they're actually focusing on things that we have some control over. So change can be difficult just from the enormity of that. So how do we get past all of these things? So people are wrestling with change for a variety of reasons, and there will be some people in your organization that are probably exhibiting all 5 of those, and they just are really, really stuck and really don't know how to move forward. So how do we overcome that? Well, the first thing we need to do is make sure that we have a good framework for change. We want to make sure that we're hanging our activities around a methodology and an approach that's going to make some sense and that's going to help people overcome some of these change difficulties. So what that is, there are 4 building blocks to change. And if you go through any of the change management methodologies that are out there, and there are several, if you do some research, just go Google change management. I think you'll get about 24 million hits on it. So, but what a lot of these methodologies have in common is a set of building blocks for change management. And I've condensed those down to these 4. We're going to go through these in a little bit. One is you have to have a good story to tell. And that really focuses on 2 things. Why is this project happening and what do we hope to get out of it? And I know that's something I've told you before. And you need to have a good answer to that question. You're going to hear it again. Because remember, I'm going to repeat this 6 or 7 times until I'm sure you all have it in your heads. So you have to have a good story to tell. Role models, you have to have role models really at every level of the organization. And I'll talk about what that looks like in a second. Capabilities. What I like to point out to people in change management is that training on the software is a necessary component. You have to have a good training program. Without it, you're just done no matter how much change management you do. It's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. You have to do more than that. You have to do a lot more communication. So a lot of governments, unfortunately, say, hey, we did change management, we had training. It's not the same thing. Training is part of change management, but it's certainly not all of it, and we're going to talk about that in a second too. And then finally, the fourth building block is reinforcement. Knowing that your change management activities, your project, are all in alignment with the city's overall goals and desired outcomes. So one of the things that I will encourage you to do throughout the implementation is to constantly keep in mind what those outcomes and goals are. What are we trying to get accomplished with this project? It will become very, very easy to get lost in the details of some intricate design step, or some configuration that isn't going very well, or some test run that's taking forever. And you can get really lost in those details, and sometimes you have to take a step back and say, what exactly are we trying to get accomplished here? So that you don't get lost in those details and kind of come back and stay focused on the outcomes. We'll talk about that some more too. So first building block, having a good story to tell. Again, the first part of that is simply, why are we doing this project? And what I would challenge you to do as a project team is to have 3 or 4 bullet points that describe why this project is happening. Why is the city investing as much money as it is in software and services to make this change happen? What are the key reasons for that? And I've listed a few up here, and they may be things that you can latch onto. You may want to tweak these for your own purposes. But these are common things that we see in a lot of governments that are tackling ERP projects. So bad data or data that isn't integrated, reports that I can't get out, takes too long to gather information. I can't rely on the data in my current system. So I have around the city approximately 42,000 different spreadsheets that actually have the right data. And it's not in, whatever those reasons may be. You have to have a good reason for doing the project, but more importantly, you have to be able to articulate that to the rest of the city. So when you're doing department meetings or someone asks you, what is that project all about? Why am I getting invited to this meeting? You have to remind people, well, we've got these things going on with our current system, and this project is about tackling those issues. So you have to have a good reason why. For a lot of people that exhibit difficulty in changing, or they exhibit a lot of resistance, simply reminding them of why the project is happening and what the goals are is enough to overcome some of that. So it's important to have this kind of building block story put together. But it's in 2 parts. The second part is, what are the goals and the outcomes? What does the city hope to accomplish with this project? And a lot of it might just be fixing the things from the first part of the story, right? Having better data integration, better analytical tools, better financial reporting. I want to be able to know that the data in the system is reliable, that the numbers are right. I can present them to the council, I can present them to the city manager, and I know they're right. Whatever those things are, whatever those goals and outcomes are, it's important that, again, 3 or 4 key bullet points that resonate with you guys, with the city, to say, this is why we're doing this project, and this is what we hope to get out of it. Without that message, it's really hard for users to kind of follow the lead you're taking in putting in new software. And it's really hard for those other departments to understand why they should use the new system to do everything from timesheets to purchase orders to invoice processing to leave management tracking and everything else. So if you've got that good story, that is a critical building block for your change management program. And it's really just those 2 things. Why are we doing this, and what do we hope to get out of it? And if you can condense that down to 3 bullet points each and make that your elevator speech so you can describe the project in 30 seconds or less, that's a great tool to have for change management. So it's really important to have that. Second building block are the people side, the role models that you have to have around the organization. And again, this is at all levels of the city. It's not just about the project team. It's not just about the sponsor, it's not just about the steering committee, it's about the organization as a whole. And it really starts at the very top. Change management is much, much easier when you've got solid executive support for the project. So from the city manager on down, there has to be solid public support for the project. So if you've got a bunch of department heads that in a private meeting say they back the project, that's great. I want them out in the hallway talking about how they support the project. And you've got to have that kind of executive support so that the rest of the organization knows that this is a priority, this project is important, that we're serious about this, we're going to finish it, we're going to do it, we're going to do it right. And that message has to come from the executive level. So hopefully we can make that happen here and make sure that that's a public thing that gets said often so that people hear it and they understand that that executive support exists. The next layer is the steering committee, and whatever that governance structure looks like. That committee needs to be very committed to working with the project management team, working with the project, allocating resources, resolving issues. What I don't want to see in a steering committee is people that maybe attend sometimes, or attendance is viewed as optional at steering committee meetings, or they don't really follow what's going on, they don't know the status of the project. That's bad. What they should be doing is being very active in that, not micromanaging. We don't want them to take the project manager role, but they should be thinking about resource allocation, resolving issues, thinking about scope and budget if there are issues with that, change orders from the vendor that need to be evaluated and decisions reached. So whatever that governance structure looks like, that group needs to be engaged and involved in making those decisions. One of the hallmarks of a successful ERP project is quick decision making. And it starts at that level. So if you can escalate an issue and get an answer back quickly, that will help make your project a lot more successful than escalating an issue and then waiting for a month while the steering committee reschedules a meeting. You just don't want to be dealing with that. It's much more effective if they can make decisions quickly. Project manager, at this level, it can be very easy to focus strictly on scope, on time, on budget. And that's great. You want to be on scope, on time, on budget. That is a good thing, without doubt. But it can't be the only thing. Because remember from our good story, we want to know what the outcomes are. What is it we want this project to accomplish for the city? So we want to have more efficient processes, we want to have better data, we want to have better financial reporting, whatever the case may be. Those don't look like on time, on budget, on scope. Okay? And so for a lot of organizations, it's important that the project manager remember it's not just about scope, time, and budget, it's also about the outcomes. And then finally, the project team itself, you all, have to remember that you are all change agents. You are all partly responsible for making sure that change happens in the organization. And that means you have to understand what those building blocks are, you have to understand the business drivers and the goals. And when you're meeting with users and there's resistance, you need to recognize where that's come from, perform some of the communication activities that we'll lay out in the communication plan, and act as change agents. And there are specific tasks that go with that, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But it's important to remember that for a lot of users, you all are the face of the project. You're the person that they're meeting with to talk about some specific business process. So you have to act as change agents and recognize that you have that role within the ERP project. Okay. Oops. Building block number 3, capabilities. As I mentioned earlier, training is important, and that's part of building capabilities. And it is a part of a good change management program, but it's not sufficient. You also have to start thinking about communicating and user engagement early in the project. And you also want to start thinking about support after the implementation is done. So the vendor is going to come in here for a year or more. They're going to help you design, configure, test the software. They'll stick around for a month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever you negotiate in the contract, and then they're gone. And they won't be on site anymore. How are you going to support that user community from then on? Now, most governments hang on to their ERP systems for about 15 years. So you need to think about, what does that support structure look like? Is it going to be a formal help desk? Is it going to be an informal user group that you develop within the city? Is it both of those things? Who's going to be able to contact the vendor for assistance? Is that one person going to be able to do that? Who is that person, and how often can they call for help? How will you log calls that users have? How will you understand if there are training issues out there? All of those support questions cannot wait until go live. And unfortunately, a lot of governments do that. They wait until the go live period to say, hey, we ought to think about support. By then it's too late. You need to be thinking about support early in the implementation, because one of the big questions that users have all through a project is, who do I call when I have a question? And you need to have an answer to that. Or at least at this stage be saying, we're not sure yet, but we know that's on our list of things to talk about and to decide. So we're going to be putting that support structure together over the next coming months, whatever that answer is. So think about it early. It's part of that building capabilities building block that's so important for change. Finally, reinforcement, which is really about alignment. It's about saying, are we aligned with the goals? Are the process changes that we're making here in the city actually going to achieve the outcomes that we said we wanted to have? So if one of your outcomes is more efficient processes, and then you look at a design and you realize you just installed 3 more levels of approval than you had before, it would be pretty hard for a user to understand how that change is going to generate that outcome. So you want to make sure you're in alignment. You want to make sure that your process changes, your design is in alignment with the overall goals. And make sure that you're thinking about that as you go through the implementation. And then of course the other elements of reinforcement. When you do have a success, when your first go live happens, when your first training sessions are done, take the time to recognize those events, celebrate those successes, and make sure that you keep that momentum going as you go forward. And you'll have plenty of opportunities to do that. So it's important to kind of do that too, to just take time out for a second and say, hey, we hit a milestone. Let's recognize the people that made that happen, and then we can start down the path of the rest of the project. So those little things can help a lot as well. Okay. So it's enough of our kind of our recap of concepts on change management. I want to shift gears now and talk specifically about change management around implementation phases that you'll be looking at as you start the implementation in January. So I'm going to talk specifically about the phases of implementation, what they are, and what happens during them, and then what the change management activities look like in each of those. We're going to talk about process change, what that looks like and when that happens in an implementation. And then one that often gets overlooked, changes in roles and responsibilities that can happen because of new processes and new software. All right, the implementation methodology. Regardless of which vendor you end up with, the implementation methodology will look something like this. There's a preparation phase, there's a design phase where we kind of on paper talk about what things are going to look like. There's a configuration phase where you go into the software and actually build tables and workflows and processes and reports. You'll want to test that, and that can take a variety of looks as well. And then finally there's a go live, where you're actually turning the new system on and going off the old system, and then post-implementation support. So whatever those things are called in the specific implementation, generically this is what they look like. So in preparation, implementation prep time. When you sign the contract, it is not the case that the vendor will show up the next day ready to go and having their first design meeting. It doesn't work that way. It'll take a few weeks to kind of ramp up. Their team needs to understand what's in the contract documents and what's going on with the project. But you do too. It's important that you have some familiarity with what the scope of work is and what's going to happen. So as you get closer to that implementation, from contract signing to the actual time when people show up on site, there's some things you can do, and I would encourage you to do these to get ready for the project. There are some documents that you'll want to review. Now the software license agreement will help you understand what modules you bought and what modules you didn't buy, and that can be kind of important. I can't tell you how many times I've been sitting in an implementation meeting 8 months into a project and people on the project team are still asking, did we buy that? So get familiar with what's in that license agreement. You don't need to understand all the legal gobbledygook that's in there, but at least know what you're getting, what pieces of the software you're actually buying. More importantly, though, I think, is the statement of work. The statement of work is a long, and I mean long, it's over 100 pages document that describes who does what. What does the vendor have to do? What do you have to do? What are you responsible for as an organization? What are they responsible for as a service provider? And it gets very specific about who leads which activities, who assists, who's responsible for documentation, who's responsible for training, who's responsible for loading and fixing software, who's responsible for generating test data. There's 100 of those things. So the statement of work is a document that, as I said, describes who does what. And it's very important to understand what you're responsible for versus what your vendor is responsible for. Okay? Why is that? Why is that so important? Because one of the things that happens on ERP projects that fail is an enormous amount of finger pointing. Well, I thought you were going to do that. Well, I thought you were going to do that. And then we go scrambling back to the contract. Well, the contract doesn't say anything about that. Well, okay, well, what does the statement of work say? Well, the statement of work, and it takes weeks before people figure that out. If you're familiar with that going in, you'll have a lot less of that finger pointing, a lot less time wasted figuring out who's doing what. So get familiar with that when it's developed. That'll be developed around the same time as the implementation services agreement and the software license. So there's a big document coming, and it's important to kind of have that handy and know what's in there. The other thing that you'll get from the vendor as you start the implementation is an overall project plan. And it's exactly what you would expect. It's a listing of all the activities that have to happen, who does them, when they happen, about how much time we're allocating for that, what dependencies there are. So task 126 can't happen until task 84 is completed, all that stuff. So there's a big project plan. Get familiar with that as well. The big thing there is milestones. There will be a milestone that says, okay, static design is done on March 30th, and initial user testing is done July 1st, or whatever those dates are. So knowing what those milestones are is important, because that'll help keep you focused and keep you from going through too much scope creep and all the bad things. Yes? Is there a difference between a milestone and a deadline? Yes, it may be partly semantics, but the vendor contract will have milestones that they get paid on. So there's a specific set of activities that results in a deliverable or several deliverables, and that triggers a payment to that vendor. So those we call milestones. Deadlines might just be any activity that's in the plan. So if you're due to have a draft of the system test plan done by August 30th, okay, that's your deadline for that, but that doesn't have anything to do with kind of the contractual side of a milestone, okay? So get familiar with that project plan and what's in there, understand what those deliverables are, milestones and dates and resources. Other things you can look at, a project charter document is important. It'll have things about your project in it, and I know one was developed during the selection phase. It would be good as a team to pull that out, brush the dust off, and update it, and take a look at it now and say, has anything changed in the last few months? Do we have the same goals, the same business drivers? Do we have the same resources we had, or has our resource pool changed? And let's get that in the project charter. So that's a good document to keep updated. There's some things in there that are important. Okay. So that's phase one of implementation, is preparation. There's just a lot of kind of reading and understanding that you can do. The second phase is design. And this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where we really start to see what change is all about. And it happens in a few places. First place that we see it are what we call static design elements. I'm going to talk about that in a second. The second place is business processes. And we start doing workflow about how information is going to move around the organization. That's the second place that we'll start to see some change happening. Third is roles and responsibilities. You'll find that you have an opportunity to make things more efficient simply by moving where they're executed. So thinking about how that might happen and the ramifications of that. So this is where we really test your ability and willingness to change is in the design phase. And it starts off fast. One of the first things you're going to do in implementation is design your chart of accounts. And every project team that you talk to will tell you that that is a really crucial thing to get right. And it's worth taking some time to think about. And there are issues with it. Most organizations have changes to their chart of accounts. Some cities, for example, will find out that we really don't need 187 different funds. We can probably condense that a little bit, make things more efficient. Or things have been added to the chart of accounts over time because of specific reporting needs, or they've been added because of specific system limitations that no longer exist. So now is the time when you can clean up that chart of accounts and say, hey, this is going to be the foundation for all of our transaction processing and our financial reporting. Let's take the time to think about this and get this right. And it's not as easy as it sounds. I know when I was in Milwaukee, we had a real issue, and I think I may have told you this story before, but we had a real issue with capital versus operational reporting because the capital account numbers were 1 digit shorter. There were 10 digits, whereas on the O&M side, they were 11 digits. So when someone wanted to ask a simple question, well, including the initial project costs and 5 years of operations, what have we spent on project XYZ? It was virtually impossible to answer that question because we had to go to literally 2 different sets of accounts and try and figure out what matched up. And it was really, really hard to do. And everyone, and this is a great example of change management, everyone in the organization agreed that's crazy. We ought to have the same structure so that we can do that kind of combined reporting when the commission asks for it. The engineers were on board, the accountants were on board, the IT people were on board. We all got in a room and started talking about that. Now, can you guess what happened? Nothing changed because no one could agree on how to do it. And the engineers were freaked out about the thought of losing history if they changed their account numbers. And the IT people were freaked out because they weren't sure they were going to be able to generate reports off of it. And the accountants were freaked out because they weren't sure what it was going to do to their financial reporting. So we ended up changing nothing. Big object lesson there for me personally. And it was a very difficult time. But it's a great example of a bunch of people with a clear issue and desire to change, but the second they sit down to the table, they can't really make the change. So chart of accounts design is one where you're really going to right off the bat see how good are we at changing. Can we actually make the changes that we talk about wanting to make? And it's very, very important that you get the chart of accounts right because it just drives everything else in the project. But there are other static design elements. There are other things you're going to think about. And I'll give you another great example of change is when you're doing payroll. Someone will say, well, what are your pay codes? Oh, well, regular time is 1, 2, 3. Overtime is 1, 2, 4. Second shift is 1, 2, 5. And what are you doing when you do that? You're replicating all the bad things that you've been doing for the last 15 years because that's what you know. And that's a static design element that you have an opportunity to change. So what I would encourage you to do is when you start seeing that happening, say, stop, does it make sense to do that? Let's question the status quo. Do these things still work? Is the way we do payroll right? Is the way we do leave management right? Is the way we code transactions right? Those are the kinds of things that you can ask yourself and make yourself, and if you do stick with something that you're doing now, then at least validate that. Say, yep, that is one that we have been doing well, and we're going to keep doing that. But ask yourselves those questions. And again, in a design session, much harder to do than you might think, and it's important to do it if you want to realize some of the outcomes and the goals that you're after. So think about those things. I've said they're going to come up quickly in the design phase. And when you're in those meetings, or you see people in those meetings, or you see the results of those meetings, stop and question the status quo. Did we do a good job of that? That's important. Okay, beyond those kind of what we call static, they're called static design elements because they don't change very much. I mean, Hopefully you're not in there jockeying with the chart of accounts every day. And there's a lot of tables like that in any given system. But beyond that, we start talking about processes. And this is where we get into workflow. And if you remember from your software demonstrations, workflow is a big part of what makes ERP so engaging and so interesting and so able to make change happen, to make things more efficient and more productive for you is around workflow. So you're going to start to think about processes. How do we get from a vendor invoice coming in the door through approval, through payment? How do we want to do that? When someone enters a timesheet, how does that timesheet get approved? How do we code that? How do we make sure that gets to payroll in one piece? How do we correct errors on the timesheet? So all of those kinds of processes, you're going to start to tear them apart in this design phase. And it's going to be, again, difficult to think about how to do it differently. To say, well, how do we make this more efficient than we've done it before? And it's going to be everything from, well, where do those invoices get mailed? Do they come in centrally or do they go to the departments? If they go to the departments, should they come in centrally? Could we be more efficient if we did that? Those kinds of questions get asked during these design steps. And this, again, is where you can test your willingness to change. Are we really willing to make things more efficient, either through centralization or decentralization or moving things around, changing the process? And are we willing to ask hard questions about how to change that process and make that go? So the other thing you want to keep in mind with process flow and workflow is you've got another consideration, which is that you don't want to modify the software. You don't want to customize the software. So you've got to kind of balance that with your process design and say, okay, this might be the world's most efficient process design, but if it's going to cause $100,000 worth of customization to the base code, we really need to think about that. So you've got kind of things you have to balance. You can't just go in willy-nilly and design around, thinking you can do anything. There are limitations. The software is not 100% flexible. There are things that it has to do the way it does them. There are best practices built into the software. The software that you'll choose probably has been installed in hundreds of governments. There's best practices, there are things that are in there. You don't want to necessarily change those. So you have to keep that in mind. There's some organizational commitment to stable software as well as organizational commitment to better processes, and you have to balance those things in that design step. There may be times when you have to think about policy changes. And we're going to talk about this a little later with resistance, but there may be things where there's some old administrative policy that hasn't changed in 30 years, but because of it, it's preventing you from doing what you want to do. That can happen in bargaining unit agreements too, which are always fun. Where you've got things like, okay, anyone who started after the second full moon in July of 1984 is eligible for this benefit plan. Well, how do you put that in a system? I mean, so a lot of those things you might have to go back and rethink. And that is not too far off from something I actually ran into. So things you might have to think about in terms of policy. But again, as you're going through these design meetings with process change, remember your business drivers and your outcomes. So when you're challenging the status quo and someone says, we can't possibly do it that way, it's important to say, well, remember what our goal is here. We're trying to make this efficient. We're trying to have better data. We're trying to make this data available around the organization. How are we going to do that if we don't change this process? So you might have to have those kinds of tough discussions during this design phase. So this is where you're seeing a lot of that kind of change management activity going on. One of the important things to keep in mind here, it will not always go as planned. And it's important not to get frustrated and not to get beaten down by meetings that don't go well or departments that suddenly get a real bee in the bonnet and want to kind of create some havoc for you. So it's not going to be perfectly smooth as you go through these, and don't let those little kind of issues get sidetrack you from the larger goal of what you're trying to get accomplished with the project. Finally, in the design phase, you're also starting to think about roles and responsibilities. I worked with a city on the West Coast a couple years ago where their risk management group was bouncing pretty much every year between the HR side and the kind of finance payroll side. And I don't think their organization chart was ever stable for more than about 12 months at a time, because that group kept moving. And it became a huge issue with their ERP implementation, because risk management and case management was a big part of their scope. Where does that function reside? We spent a lot of time talking about what makes the most sense. And there were so many political overtones to that, because it turned out that the person in charge of it didn't really like this other person over here and didn't want to report to that group because they didn't get along. But this other person wrote a bad review for that person 5 years ago. So you get into all those kinds of battles too. So it's, yeah, this whole notion of roles and responsibilities gets bigger than the software and the processes, and it's important to recognize that. So when you're in a process workflow and you start thinking, oh, well, why don't we just move that to AP and then we can eliminate these 2 extra steps, just remember that that might cause some issues for somebody. So roles and responsibilities can definitely move, but you want to kind of keep in mind that that's not going to be easy for everybody, and there's going to be some opposing viewpoints there as you go through it. So communication around role change is absolutely critical. If you're going to move something on the org chart, make sure that you've got a good business reason for doing that and that you can explain that clearly. Because people are going to be impacted by that, and they're going to need to know why is that happening? What benefit does that provide the city? Okay? So that all happens during design. And right about now you're thinking, okay, can I get out of this design part and just do something else? But those are crucial activities, and that's where you're really going to define what the solution looks like. But once that's more or less complete, and understand that it might be iterative. You might do design just for GL first, and then do AP, AR, and then do purchasing. But eventually you're going to move into what we call configuration and build, and then right following that is the test phase. So let's talk about that for a second. This is where you have, I think, a terrific opportunity to engage the user community of the city, is in these phases. Largely because you need to test your configurations. And you need to say, well, okay, this is what we came up with for this workflow. We need to test it and make sure it's going to work. Here's 10 test transactions. Let's see what happens with them in the system. Well, you on the project team could certainly take a day or two and just execute those and jot down the results, and that would be great. But how much better would it be from a change management perspective if you got a small user group to come in and execute the test for you and have them go in there and say, okay, show me quickly how to enter these transactions, and make them part of the solution? Does that take more time? Yeah. Does it take more resources? Yes. Is it invaluable? Yes. So any chance you get to engage the wider user community, I would encourage you to think about it and try to get them involved. Now, there are going to be some places where that doesn't make a ton of sense, but where it does, think about bringing users into the process and saying, hey, you can help us out here. Typically, the way that's done is you'll identify subject matter experts in payroll and benefits and time entry and HR and invoice processing and purchase orders and P-cards and contracts and bids. Find those subject matter experts, have them come in and help you with some of this stuff. And you'll find that acceptance of the system overall will grow, because they'll have a good experience with it, hopefully. And then they go back to their departments, and what do they talk about? Hey, this is what's going to happen. I got in there, I got to see the software and do some things. It looks really good. It looks like things are going to happen. So hopefully they're able to kind of tell that story once they've had a chance to participate in some of these activities. Other areas where you can do that, developing the training plan. Training is a logistical nightmare. It just is. If you've got 800 people that need to learn how to use a new time entry screen, how are you going to do that? Bringing in some user groups that have a lot of interaction with that process and invite them to the discussion and say, hey, we're thinking about how to do this. What do you think would work? And invite them to participate in that. Same thing with post-implementation support. If you're thinking about establishing a help desk, have some users review that and give you some feedback on it. So there's a lot of opportunity to get user engagement in this kind of configuration, design, and test phase. And it's important to try to do that as much as possible. When you do have a success with that, and this is important, When you do bring users in and they have a good experience with it, encourage them to share their experience with their other coworkers and kind of spread. That way, you're kind of leveraging the experience that they've had to do more communication. And you don't have to do it all. So if you've got a bunch of subject matter experts and key users that are having good experiences, they've been to some good meetings, they've helped out with some stuff, let them tell that story to say, hey, this is what's going on. It'll help you kind of spread the message of what the project is all about. And as long as they've got that and want to do that, you may as well leverage that as you go forward. Okay. Go live and post-implementation. These are interesting areas. I think when people think of go live, they sometimes think of this like we're going to flip a switch. Okay, I'm going to go into the master control room, and on the old system, I'm going to close it like Igor in Frankenstein. We're going to close that, and we're going to open up the other one, and on Monday morning, it's all going to work. And it's just not like that. Go lives actually tend to occur over several days or even weeks as you turn various features on. And really, if you do a good job with testing and design and documentation and training, go live should really almost be a non-event. It should just be, well, yeah, this is how we do it now. So hopefully, as you go through your implementation, you'll have that experience that, hey, we did a lot of the hard work up front. The go live itself was kind of a, no big deal, got it done, easy to do. But two areas. One, user training, as I mentioned, a lot of logistics to think about. How are we going to do training? In all likelihood, with your vendor, you are going to end up developing the materials for training, doing all the scheduling, and conducting it. So from a user training perspective, odds are the vast majority of that is going to fall on your shoulders. And because it is such a logistical nightmare, it'd be good to start thinking about that early on in the implementation and thinking about how can we plan that, what's the right way for us to do that. Because if from a change management perspective, one good way to screw up all the good work you did is to have a bad training experience. So for users that are going to go through training, you want to make sure it's well planned, well thought out, they get a lot out of it, they're excited about it, they've got good documentation to take back with them, they know what's going to happen when, and that comes from a training plan. So if you can build that as part of your change management effort, hopefully you'll have a lot less headaches with actually executing training. Same thing with post-implementation support. Odds are you will have to write the user manual. The vendor is not going to do that for you. They will give you the technical manuals for how the system works and how the databases are set up and all that kind of stuff. But you will have to write the actual user training material as well as kind of the procedure manual that they take back with them. Help screens, something else you might have to actually go in and do the text for user help in the system. So there's a lot to think about from a support perspective. And again, golden opportunity to reach out to the user community and provide them with the tools they need to be successful. And that's part of the change management effort too, is to make sure that those things happen. So whatever structures you come up with for post-implementation support, just recognize there's a lot of work that goes into that, and the earlier you start that, the better off you'll be. Okay. I'm going to shift gears again, get out of implementation and talk about resistance and then some strategies for overcoming it. I have not come across any organizations that haven't exhibited huge amounts of user resistance no matter how much communication we did. So it's not a question of what can we do to avoid resistance, it's a question of what can we do to overcome it. And what you want to do, if you look on the graph on the screen here, is you don't want that red line, which is no communication, no communication, no communication. Start to have some communication about 2 weeks before go live, and then watch the resistance levels just go sky high. Because nobody had any clue this was coming, they have no idea what's going on or why, and so resistance goes up through the roof. What I'd rather have you do, and I think what most organizations would rather do, is get out there now, get the resistance out on the table now, and during the implementation, overcome it early so that when go live happens, you've kind of already covered everything that users are coming up with. So what we want to do during implementation is be able to recognize where that resistance is coming from and overcome it early and not wait until you go live on the new system to try to overcome that, okay? So what does resistance look like? These are some of the things you will hear from your users and from other people in the city, stakeholders. You might even hear some of these things on the project team, right? And some of these are personal favorites, but these are all signs that someone is maybe not all the way on board with where you're going yet. So these are the kinds of things that you'll hear around the organization in various meetings. It'll take various forms. And these are all, again, forms of resistance to what you're trying to get accomplished. So where does that come from? First of all, as I mentioned, we are creatures of habit. We are human beings. As human beings, we like to have things today be the same as they were yesterday. And we like to be able to anticipate that things tomorrow will be the same as they are today. And of course, within big ERP project, that is exactly what you are not doing. You are changing how things are. So as creatures of habit, it's very difficult to overcome that, and that shows up as resistance to the overall project. Secondly, as humans, we tend to value consistency over correctness. It's more important for us to be consistent with what everyone else is doing than it is to be right. Now, there's a few, obviously, outliers to that, but by and large, staff in any given organization would rather be consistent than correct. Well, consistent, again, means I want to do things the same way that I did them yesterday, and the day before, and the month before, and the year before. And I don't necessarily care if this is the new right way to do it, because it's different than the way I'm doing it now. So a lot of that resistance shows up simply because people want to be consistent with what they were doing before, and now we're not going to be. Finally, everyone wants stability. You want to know that you're going to come to work and park in the same spot and go to the same office and have the same tools to do your job, right? I mean, every time I fly out here, I take flight United 5031, and I sit in seat 3B every time. Now, why do I do that? I mean, that's kind of silly, right? But I do it because it's consistent and it's stable and I know how it's going to go and I don't have to think about it. So similarly, staff and even project team members would like things to be very stable. I would like to come to the same place, park my car in the same spot. Does anybody here park their car in a different spot every day? Okay, you're weird. But one thing you do want to have the same, though, is when you flip on your computer in the morning, I want to see the same login screen, I want to see the same software, I want to see the same tools. And what are you doing with an ERP project? You're changing that. So that creates that instability, and it creates the kind of resistance that you're going to see from people. Change and resistance can show up in a couple of different ways. Certainly there's the overt resistance that you'll get, when someone just literally says, I'm not going to do that. I will continue to track vacation balances on my spreadsheet. I don't care about this new HR system. And that's just overt, in your face, easy to recognize resistance. Other resistance will be a little softer, passive aggressive. Get invited to a meeting, say they're going to show up and then don't show up. Promise to provide some documentation and then don't provide it. Promise to review something and don't review it. So there's different ways that resistance shows up from various types of people. So we're going to talk about that now. It shows up from various types of people. So we're going to talk about that now. First of all, recognize, and this is important, not all resistance is bad. Okay? Just because you have resistance doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. First of all, I would rather have users who are engaged in the discussion as opposed to someone who says, whatever, I don't care. Because if they're resisting, it means it's something that matters to them. And they care about it, and so they're going to have these kinds of discussions with you because it's important to them. So resistance is an indicator of level of commitment from the group that you're working with. So if you get a lot of resistance, recognize that it's because it's important to them, and it's important that it be right. And if you look at it that way, you can kind of fight back those feelings of getting defensive about some of your process changes and things. Just recognize that it's because it matters to them is where that resistance is coming from. Secondly, resistance can force you to validate some things. So you've probably, in most process design work, made some assumptions about how things are going to go. Maybe you made some assumptions about transaction volume. Oh, we get about X number of invoices in every week. Or there's really only about Y number of errors on timesheets every week. So you designed a process around those assumptions, and it may turn out that you need to validate those assumptions. So maybe you thought you only got 50 invoices, but it turns out you really got 500. Well, that might cause you to kind of change a little bit about what that process looks like, or the resources allocated to that process. So resistance can be a way of forcing you to validate the assumptions that you made as you did your design work. It can be an indicator of feasibility. Is this new process actually going to work? As you can imagine, there are going to be things that look good on paper and then in practice turn out to be gut-wrenching nightmares. And resistance can be a way to kind of provide an early indicator of that, to say, hey, we really need to kind of check some things on this. Maybe this isn't going to be as feasible as we thought. So again, if you look at resistance in a positive light and say, hey, that can help us rethink this a little bit. And remember that resistance means they're being inquisitive, that it matters to them and they care. Yeah, you have a question?
So what do you do with...
So the question is, how do we engage people who are in a wait mode, who are taking, I call that the this too shall pass resistance method, where they're sitting back and waiting and figuring that over time this will go away, we won't actually get this done. If you can hold that question, I've got that a little bit later in the presentation. But that is a resistance strategy. It's one of the passive-aggressive strategies that people will take. And really, if you think about it, they're taking a wait-and-see approach. So, that, I mean, in a nutshell, the way to overcome that is to actually do it. And actually just get it done. And usually what happens then is that people, because they crave consistency and stability, if they see everybody else doing it, they will do it too. But the key is to get everyone else to actually do it. But that's a tricky one. It's one that a lot of people take. Okay, when you look around the city, you're going to see different types of people at different levels of acceptance of the project. And it's important to kind of understand what these groups look like, because when you have a change management program, you're not going to be able to get to everybody. I mean, you're just not. There's simply too many people here at the city to try to have individualized change management programs for. So let's think about the types of groups of people that we have. The first group, these are people who are already on board with everything you're doing. They wanted the new system, whatever it's going to be, a year ago. They think you're on the right path, but they wish you would have taken it earlier. They come to every meeting early, and they stay late, and they talk about it. And this is a group that's very engaged, very excited, and typically it's a smaller percentage, 10, maybe 15% of the organization will be in this group, where they're just excited, can't wait, ready to dump it all. They've got a 6-foot-high stack of paper on their desk, and they can't wait to get rid of it. So they're excited. They're behind you all the way. You do not need to pay any attention to these people. They are already following you. Why waste time trying to convince them to do something that they're already convinced they want to do? So it's important to bring them in and engage them, and make sure that if they're out there telling the story, that they have a chance to do that. But do we need to dedicate hours and hours of change management to them? No, they're already with you. So it's a good group. The hard part about that, and the reason you want to recognize that group, is that you will gravitate to them because they're fun people to be with, right? They're doing what you're doing, and they're excited about it just like you're excited about it. All of a sudden you find yourselves, going for coffee, you're having lunch with them. When you just sit and have a hallway conversation, they're the people you're talking to. And you want to try to, it's fun to do and good to do, and it certainly keeps your morale high, but just recognize that that's not the group you really need to be spending a whole lot of time with from a change management perspective. But you will, we all do, because they're fun people to be with. Group 2, and these are your wait and see people, they're not sure. They need to be convinced. They're not necessarily against what you're trying to do with the ERP project, the HATS project, but they're not necessarily for it either. It's like, I just want to see what this is going to look like before I commit to it. They really do want to see the impact, they want to see the benefits. So an example I always use is one of the goals of a lot of ERP projects is to have managers do their own reports. You shouldn't be calling IT all the time to run a report for you. We have tools on the desktop now. Run your own reports. And then a lot of managers will sit back and say, okay, let me see somebody else do it first. And that's, you need one person. All you need is literally one person who runs their own query, runs their own report, shows up at a meeting and has killer numbers and is great because they did their own analysis and they didn't have to wait for it. And now all of a sudden all the other managers are like, huh, okay, I guess that works. And now they'll go off and do it. So that's an example of those wait and see people. They just want to know that there really is an impact, there really is a benefit. And they literally, it's, you know, they're from the show me state, and they really want to know that this will actually work before they commit to it. So the person in accounts payable who's tracking leave balances on a spreadsheet is not going to give that spreadsheet up until they know that the data in the system is accurate. You know, that's another example of that kind of group 2 person. They're not necessarily against using the system. They just want to know that the data is actually going to be there before they commit to it. So, you know, the easiest way to overcome that, as I said earlier, just actually do it. Actually have the data there, have the tools on the desktop, have somebody actually executing it. And then those wait and see people will start to, the snowball will start to roll downhill and pick up all of those wait and see people. This group, unfortunately, is usually the biggest group of users in any organization. 70 to 75% of any given city or county, this is the type of people you're dealing with. And this is where I think it's important to have your change management activities focused. So when we talk about communications, when we talk about getting out there and talking about the project and gathering feedback from users, user engagement, participating in meetings, participating in testing and design and training development, this is the group we want to target those things to, is to this wait and see group. Okay, because they're the people that will follow you. They just need to know what you're doing. So let's get out there with the change management program and get this group moving. Now the third group is your blatant resistors to change. These are people that no matter what you do, they are not following you. They have no interest in your new system. They have no interest in new processes. They have no interest in giving up their spreadsheets. They are simply not going to do this project in any way, shape, or form. And literally nothing you do is going to change that. So again, from a change management perspective, it's largely a waste of time to spend a lot of time dealing with this particular group of people. Because no matter what you do, they're not going to change. Now, there's a couple things about this group that I think are important to know. One, they tend to be very visible. They wear their resistance like a badge of honor. Like, I am fighting this tooth and nail, and I'm going to tell you how I'm fighting it tooth and nail. They will talk, you know, anything negative they can about the project. They'll try to get other people to have their point of view about how the project's not going to work. We don't have enough people, it's the wrong software, they've got all those things going on, and they like to talk about that. So they're visible, by and large. They like to talk about how they're resisting the project. These are people who sometimes have an exit strategy. They've already got their resume done, they're job hunting, they've got applications. You'll see their resume on the copy machine because they don't want to tell you they're looking for a job, but they want you to know that they're looking for a job. And so they'll do stuff like that. And again, this is only about 5 to 10% of any given organization, but it's not a group that you want to spend a lot of time dealing with because they're just not going to change anyway. So for this group, they more need to be managed. So if you've got somebody out there who's got some kind of just blatant negativity and they're constantly, talking just nasty things about the project, you definitely want to haul them in a room and tell them to knock it off and find ways to mitigate that. And usually that has to come from an executive level. But so you need to manage that. But to try to change it is largely a waste of time. That is an excellent point. Executives play a key role at that point in continuing to provide that visible support. In fact, that's why I say executive support isn't just important, it has to be visible. So, people who then have that blatant resistance, they literally have nowhere to go. It's because the executives are saying, this is the direction the organization is taking, now's the time to get on board. So you're right, that is a key message that executives can deliver throughout the implementation project. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kickoff event, when implementation kicks off, which is where I think it's really important to have a lot of visible executive support at that. And that has to then continue through the implementation. And you're right, communication between that executive layer and the project team is really important. So you guys should feel comfortable escalating those issues, and they should feel comfortable taking care of it. And that's going to be really important to do. You had a? Yeah, I think. So the question is, how far do we go with acknowledging and recognizing issues before we step in and take some actions? If you hold that thought, we've got a whole series of action steps that you can take with that, and it touches on exactly that. In fact, the first step is acknowledging. So we're going to talk about that in just a second. In fact, we're going to talk about it right now. So action step number one, when you encounter someone who's kind of in between group 2 and group 3 or in group 2, and they're in a meeting and they're objecting to what you're trying to do, or they're just constantly throwing up roadblocks, the very first thing you need to do, and often the most difficult thing to do, is to just listen and simply empathize with their position. Try to understand their objections, repeat them back so that they know you understand their objections and where they're coming from, and really be very empathetic with them. What I've found over the years is that for a lot of people that are just constantly saying, that can't work, that won't work, this won't work, what they really want to do is they just want to talk it out. If I can just talk you through this whole process and get it all out of my head, I'll be fine. So a lot of good listening is important. That's the first thing you should do with someone who's in that group 2 is listen to what they're saying, and let them know that you heard them. And a lot of times you'll find that once they're done talking, they're like, okay, I'm okay now. I just wanted to say that. They just want to say their piece, and then they're good to go. Other times those objections are real. They'll point out something that you hadn't thought about. So it's and you won't know that unless you first listen. So get feedback from the user community and listen when you come across resistance and objections. And don't discount things right away. Second thing you can do when you're talking with people who are in this mode of resisting change is to constantly focus on the outcomes. Easily my favorite way of overcoming resistance is to simply point to the goals of the project and ask a person who's resisting change, how are we going to achieve these goals if we don't make these changes? If we don't change this process, how are we going to be more efficient in invoice processing? And for people who are resisting change and focused on keeping things the same, 90% of the time, it is impossible for them to answer that question because they can't, because there is no good answer to that question. So what am I doing when I use that tactic? I'm focusing on the outcomes. I'm not focusing on what we're doing or what the software does or what the documentation looks like. I'm focused on the outcome. What is the benefit we're trying to get out of this? And then again, challenge that person to point out how that benefit can be realized if we stick with what we have now. And again, 9 times out of 10, the answer is going to be, well, I can't. Well, then I guess we need to make this change. So it's a really, really good kind of non-threatening tactic to take with people, especially in that group 2, who just, after they've kind of talked it out and they want to talk more about a process change, it's a good way to kind of get them over the hump. Third step you can take, again, presuming you listen first, a lot of cases, people are looking for reassurance. And this is really, at this step, what they really want to know is my job going to still be here, and will it still look mostly the same? when you're done with this project. Without question, the number one thing I get when I do focus groups with users, when I do focus groups with the user community, I make sure there's literally no one on the project team or from the governance structure in the room. And I just ask people, what is really going on here? And the most frequent answer I get is, I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. I'm afraid that you're going to reorganize me right out of this city or county or school district or what have you. And so what is that person looking for? They just want some reassurance that that's not what you're trying to do. And if I look at your desired goals and outcomes, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to see goal number one, massive staff reduction. I don't think that's what you're all about here. I don't think that's what any government is necessarily trying to do with their ERP project. And in my 20 years of doing this, I've never seen a government eliminate a position strictly because new technology came in the door. Now, they might not fill vacant positions, or they might repurpose positions. That certainly happens. But to flat out, turn your laptop and office keys in on your way out the door, that just doesn't happen. So a lot of these people are really just looking for reassurances that I'm going to be okay, that whatever process changes and technology you're bringing in, I'll be able to handle it. Now, kind of a subset of this group is they might not be necessarily afraid of losing their jobs, but they might be afraid that they can't learn the new system. So your really long-term employees that have been paper and pencil and now your legacy system, that's all they know, might be just really scared to death that they're not going to be able to handle it. And again, what they're looking for is reassurances that you recognize that your training program will be focused on making sure that they have the skills and capabilities, and that you won't stop that training program until they do have the skills and capabilities to move forward. So at this point, they're just looking for reassurances. And it's your job as change agents to provide that. To say, look, we're not out to fire your department or anything like that, or for the people that are worried about learning a new system, letting them know that they'll get the support they need until they're successful and can get it. So reassurance is a great way to overcome some of that resistance. Having done all of those things, you may still find some people that are resisting your project and don't want to go forward with process change. And at some point, you just have to have the difficult conversation. And so for these people, what does that difficult conversation look like? It is literally, look, the city is moving in this direction. We are going to this new software. This process is going to look like this. If you don't follow the way the city wants to do this, we're going to start down the discipline path, or whatever the consequences is for your organization. And sometimes you just have to have that hard conversation. Again, does that typically come from the executive level? Yes, it does. It's typically from a higher level employee who will sit that person down and kind of have that hard conversation with them. So think about kind of at the executive level, who's good at that, and find that person and get them prepped, because there will be people that just have to hear that, that there are no other options. This is where we're going, and the consequence of not following is this. The important thing to do, though, is remember that it's not your job to change that person. It's your job to create an environment where change can happen. So the employee has to make that decision. It's up to the employee to say, okay, I'm going to embrace the new stuff, or I'm not. It's their call. But there has to be consequences to each of those options. So your job is to identify the consequences, not to beat them over the head with a hammer, baseball bat, whatever implement you have in your office right now. Other things you can do. In a lot of cases, resistance comes from kind of blips in the project. And here's what can happen. You can have a project that gets a little bit behind, and then a little bit more behind, and then another issue comes up that you weren't thinking about, and you get a little bit more behind. And now you've got a group of users who are kind of saying, I'm not sure this is ever going to happen. This doesn't look good. They're making mistakes. We're not where we thought we were going to be. So they're kind of latching on to the negative side. And this is where the leaders in the organization, the executives again, have to, again, provide that message of, we're going to get back on track and create hope. Create the notion that we are going to fix this. This project will be successful. We might be late. We might not have the scope we thought we were going to, whatever the case may be. But executives have to get out there and create that message that we're going to continue and we're going to be successful. And we will overcome the problems we've had and whatever that message is. So again, that's got to come from the executive level to kind of create that message of hope and create that atmosphere for change. So that's the job of kind of the executive level. The project sponsors, department directors have to do that and be able to do that. Finally, there's some kind of other things you can do, and I've tried a couple of these with some success. Case studies of other governments. There are people who like to know that the project you're undertaking has been done somewhere else. And one thing that I did in Milwaukee is I had a neighboring county that went through the same project come in to a team meeting just for half an hour to talk about what they did and some of the issues they encountered. And it was really helpful to know that, oh, someone else has done this too. I can see that and see that they got through it and were successful with it. So kind of the case study testimonial from another organization can sometimes help to get people past that. Site visits, guest speakers. I've seen larger organizations tend to use the guest speaker idea to kind of come in and do a presentation and kind of get people's morale boosted sort of talk. So that sort of thing can be helpful as well. So there's a lot of different things you can kind of do to kind of bring people from the outside in to kind of help overcome resistance or just morale issues as you go forward. Okay. Other things that may happen, and remember, despite all of that, despite all of those action steps, there are going to be some people that just don't get it and aren't going to get it. And again, there's not much you can do about that other than lay out those consequences and just follow through. So if the consequence is we're going to start down the discipline path with you if you don't do this, or we're going to have to find another person for your position, whatever the consequence is, have it be real and then follow through on it. It's pretty much all you can do at that point with that person. So, okay. So let's walk through some examples. And again, I use these as ways for you to kind of, when you see these kinds of behaviors or hear these kinds of things, recognize what's going on as you go through your implementation. So the first one, what I call the only game in town strategy. And this is the employee, and you probably know someone like this, who has the killer spreadsheet that, without this spreadsheet, the entire city would cease operations, Armageddon would ensue, and it'd be awful. And so they've got this power base because they've got all this information locked up on their PC, and it's in this killer spreadsheet, and no one else has access to it. And now you're coming in with your new software, which is a direct and imminent threat to my killer spreadsheet. And I am not pleased about this, and I'm going to fight tooth and nail. So what you can do with this person is, what I like to do is I don't even try to challenge their notion of, okay, this is your power base. What I try to do is show them that by moving to the system and sharing that data, it actually expands their power base. Because with more people asking more questions about that data, they become even more valuable. So by becoming, instead of a hoarder of information, a sharer and analyst of information, they actually increase their value to the organization. Is that a conversation you have to have about 17 times before they believe you? Yeah. But it does work to kind of get that person to let go of that killer spreadsheet. So that's something to watch out for. I said you might even already be thinking about people who are like that, but recognize that that's one way to overcome that resistance strategy. Second one, and this is very common, the We Are the World strategy, where virtually every organization I walk into has at least one department that says we are the most unique department in state and local government across North America. We just are. And there is no way that your new system can possibly accommodate the degree of complexity that we have here in our department. And this is the story that they tell. And what's funny is you go through the department and every person says exactly the same. Oh, we're really unique. And so they've got kind of this mentality that you can't help them, that we are so beyond what you could possibly do for us. So what do we do with that group? Well, the first thing we have to do is talk about requirements. So when someone says they're truly unique, what I like to do is say, okay, show me how. Show me how what you do and what you need to do and the data that you need to have is so much different than every other department that I've worked with in my, please show me. And you have to kind of get in their face and challenge them and say, all right, I need to see how you're different. What do you do differently? And oftentimes you find out that the requirements or the things that they say you can't possibly do aren't really requirements. They're just kind of things that we've traditionally done or data that we've traditionally tracked. So when I see kind of a weird piece of data that I'm not used to seeing, I'll say, well, what do you do with that piece of data? Oh, we store it. Okay. How long? Well, forever. And it never shows up on a report and it's not used anywhere. So this really unique thing that they do turns out to be actually not anything that anybody needs to do. But you can't get there unless you can kind of challenge them to show you what those requirements are and how to demonstrate that uniqueness. Again, a tough conversation, not one that's really fun to have, but that's what you have to do with a department like that, is show me how unique you are. Now, a lot of times, too, you'll have to back that up by showing how the new system can meet the requirements that are there. So that they see the flip side, which is here's how you're going to manage those requirements. The key, though, is to focus on real requirements, not made up stuff that we keep track of just because we've always kept track of it. So focusing on requirements and then demonstrating how the system is going to meet that need is how you can overcome that. Again, repeat that message. You will have that meeting with that department many times. And you will repeat the same things over and over. And at some point, you'll be beating your head against a wall, but keep at it, and it'll be successful. Okay. The rules. This is a resistance strategy, again, very common. We can't do that because the council passed a resolution during the Kennedy administration that says we are not able to do this. And no one knows if that's really true or not. And so what happens is it ends up being a roadblock for both the users and the project team. So what do we do with that? There's something out there. Clearly, the first thing you need to do is validate that it's real. And if you have a chance to, talk to the council, go to the city manager, go to the department directors, and say, is this real? Do we really have this rule? And then two things can happen. Either you find out that it isn't, it's old and we stopped doing that eons ago. I don't know what they're telling you that for. Or you'll find out that, yeah, it's real, but it's one we could easily get rid of or change. So validate that rule that someone's coming up with, and then see if it's something that you can either get taken off the books or can have a change made. Again, that requires executive action typically. And you may encounter, you have to be aware of this too, you may actually encounter something that really is real. There may be a provision in a bargaining unit agreement that you just cannot get around. And I run into that a lot with compensation and benefit plans with bargaining units, where it's, I know it's silly, but if they started prior to September 1, 1974, they, and there's only 3 people in this benefit plan, and they're not due to retire for another 2 years, so yes, we have to do this. And there simply is no way out of it. So you have to recognize that too. When you go through the validation step, you may actually come across something like that. I don't think that happens very often, but when you do have to make some accommodation for it. Okay. Another fun one, analysis paralysis, is where we're coming up with a suggestion or a design or a process workflow, some form of information or reporting that we want to do, and someone says, you know, we really ought to look at that more. We ought to examine that more. We ought to find out if that's something we can do here in Colorado, or you know, we need to do some more analysis around that. And what's interesting about this resistance strategy is it sounds so compelling. When is it ever a bad idea to not study something further? You know, and they'll come up with great stuff like that. Like, well, why wouldn't we want to take an extra week to look at this, or an extra 2 weeks to look at this? The hard part about this resistance strategy is that it never goes away, because when you answer those questions, there will be another one, and it'll be another 2 weeks, and another 2 weeks, and another 2 weeks, and all of a sudden you've got a situation where you're 3 months behind on a design element because you've been studying it to death. And there's just way too much analysis going on. And one of the things that I have found with ERP projects, and I'm gonna overstate this intentionally, I would rather have you make a bad decision now than the right decision 6 months from now. Because quick decisions are a hallmark of ERP success. If you can make decisions quickly, you'll be a lot closer to a successful project. So studying and studying and studying can delay something by months and then only provide, you know, an incremental benefit. And you just don't want to fall into that trap. So the way to do that, make sure you have a really good governance and decision-making structure. In your project charter and in your statement of work, it should be very clear how issues get escalated and how decisions get made. It is very, very important that you document who gets to make what kind of decision, so that you have quick decision making and someone can say, that's my area, we're going to go with option A or option B, and get those decisions made quickly. So you've got to have a governance structure with, again, very clear roles and responsibilities to overcome that kind of analysis paralysis that can crop up on any project. Okay. Another one that'll crop up is asking an outside party. Or we need to refer this to the consultants. And as a consultant, I'm on the receiving end of a lot of these kinds of questions. I mentioned earlier an example with that group from a West Coast city that was moving the risk management group around. I actually got a formal letter requesting GFOA guidance on where risk management should reside in an organization. And you know, now why did that happen? Not because they couldn't make that decision, because they didn't want to. You know, because it's politically tricky to make that decision. There's ramifications if they make that decision. All of those ramifications go away if you have a third party do it. So it's a way of shifting risk, of saying, this is too hard for us, we're going to have somebody else do it, and that's a way to protect myself and protect my organization. Again, similar to the last strategy we talked about, the way around this is decision-making structures and good governance, roles and responsibilities that are clearly understood. Now, it's not to say that you should never go to a third party. There are times when that is a good idea. In our case at GFOA, if you've got some tricky chart of accounts financial reporting issue and you want to talk to somebody about how this shows up on a CAFR, that seems like a reasonable question. It's when it gets out of control that you want to kind of make sure you step in and have a good decision-making structure, good governance structures. Okay, one that you absolutely have to watch out for, the rumor mill. One of the reasons that we have a communication plan on paper that we actually execute and talk about the project, get feedback on the project, is for the very simple fact that if you don't provide information to the city and the user community, don't worry, they'll make it up. And what they make up will be appalling. So you don't want to have that happen. You want to get out there and provide the communication that they're looking for. And it's not just project status or who's doing what when, or who's that guy from the software company. It's not any of that. It's what are we talking about with this project? What's the impact going to be? What are the benefits going to be? When am I going to get trained? Are we doing training? What's training going to look like? Now let's take that training question. Let's say you don't answer that. or you don't know. I don't know. I don't know what we're doing for training. We haven't gotten that far yet. What's that person going to do? They're going to run back to their department. We're not going to get trained. You know, you're like, I never said that. But that's how the rumor mill gets going. So it's important to get in front of those things, provide that communication, get that feedback. When you do get that nasty rumor that's going around, it's very important to have one of the executives kind of come in and address it right away. So again, one of the rumors that I've heard a few times is, oh, they're going to fire 5% of the staff once the ERP system is live. You know, and when that happened at a client of mine, I had the mayor of the city at a project team meeting to say that is not what this project is about. That is not going to happen. That is not a goal of ours. So when that does happen, and you can't always control the rumor mill, as hard as you might try to get in front of these things, there's bound to be something out there. Have one of the executives get in front of the organization and deal with it very, very quickly and very forthrightly. Don't try to talk around it. Just deal directly with the issue, and you'll find that you can kind of control the rumor mill and at least prevent it from doing damage to your project. Okay. So we just kind of want to recap. We've gone through a lot of material here. I just want to kind of recap quickly what we've been through. So a successful change management program, very important to the success of the overall ERP project. And what we have to do is think about user needs. We have to think about communication. Our communication plan and our change management activities have to be practical. Again, it is not possible to have a sit-down 1-hour meeting with every employee to talk about the time entry screen. So we have to find ways that are practical, that make use of the resources we have available for change management, and make sure that we're getting out there and executing those. And then make sure that those activities around communication are integrated with the overall implementation plan. So when you're getting ready for testing is not the time to be talking about initial design. You know, so your message has to be appropriate to where you are in the implementation. The way to do that, integrate those communication activities with the steps of the implementation plan. So when you get that from the vendor, December sometime, depending on your time frame, is when you can sit down with your communication plan and then lay out when things are going to happen. Remember the building blocks that we talked about earlier for a good change management program? Have a good story to tell, have your elevator speech ready to go. Those 2 questions, why are we doing this project? What do we hope to get out of it? 3 or 4 bullet points is all you need. And have that story, and have some consensus around that. So make sure that you as a project team agree on what those drivers and outcomes are, and you're all saying the same things. Because what you don't want is to have somebody saying one thing, somebody else saying something else. It creates confusion. So make sure you've got consensus and a real solid story to tell. Secondly, role models. Again, remember that everyone in the organization is a change agent, that everyone from the top executive on down has a role to play on the project, and they will be needed at various stages of the project to execute that role. And that role models are absolutely critical to the success of a project. Capabilities, training is important but not sufficient. You've got to do more than that. There's got to be communication. You have to gather feedback. You have to do user engagement. It's not enough just to say, hey, we did change management, we had a training program. Training program is important, but not by itself. And then finally, reinforcement. Our last building block is really around alignment. Do we have the right tools in place to accomplish the outcomes that we said we wanted to accomplish? Do we have the resources in the right place to accomplish what we said we wanted to accomplish? Does our design make sense given what we want to accomplish? So making sure that we're in alignment, and then when we are, celebrate those successes and keep moving forward and keep telling the story. With resistance, remember the strategies that we just talked through. First of all, listen. Very important that you listen to objections and empathize with users and what they're going through. Secondly, focus on what's going to happen, what the outcomes are, instead of how it's going to happen. So stay focused on your goals, remind people what the outcomes are, and challenge people if you need to talk about how are these goals going to be realized if we don't do this project. Take away some of the barriers to change, provide reassurance when you need to. If you have to have the hard sit-down discussion with choices and consequences, that's an executive role, and you need to feel comfortable escalating that to the executive level when it happens. And then rely on that executive layer to also create hope around the organization, to remind people that this is an important project, it's a high priority project, and regardless of any bumps in the road, we're going to keep moving forward, and we're going to make sure that this gets done successfully. And then finally, demonstrate the benefits of the project. If you need to, bring in some outside parties, have some case studies, bring in guest speakers, what have you, to help convey the message that this is, that this is an important project and that it can be successful, and it's been successful elsewhere. Okay? Now, before I wrap up, next steps, things that you think you should be working on as we get towards contract negotiation, the implementation kickoff. I invite you to please share this presentation that you heard today around the organization. I understand we're being taped and it'll get posted, but then let people know that it's out there, that they can take a look at it and hear about some of these things. Get your elevator speech in order if it's not already. It's going to become more important as we get closer to implementation. The implementation kickoff event, I haven't talked about this very much, but it's really the first big change management event. Is when the vendor's here and we're actually going to kick off the implementation. It's a chance to build a lot of positive energy around the project. You've got a lot of good things to say at that point. You've got all your partners here. So the kickoff event, if it's well done, can do a lot of the things we talked about. You can demonstrate executive commitment. You can demonstrate that you've got the resources and the approach and the plan to be successful. You can have user engagement by having them attend the kickoff event. And if you want to do balloons and cookies, I'm all in favor of balloons and cookies. Given that the project acronym is HATS, just saying. So some things you can do around the kickoff event to kind of help make that a good change management event as well. A communication plan we developed a while back. Once that implementation plan is delivered from the vendor, we'll want to integrate that. That's probably going to happen in the next 6 to 8 weeks, I would think. And you'll want to make sure that your communication activities are wired into that implementation plan. And then you want to start planning your first set of post-kickoff communications. And what is that going to look like? Typically, you want to let people know what the schedule is when they see vendor personnel walking around the hallways. Who are those people? Letting people know ahead of time they're going to be invited to meetings, especially subject matter experts, that, hey, you're going to be involved in a design meeting. Letting people know where if you have a collaboration website, hey, we're going to be posting documents for you to review out here. So some things you can do post-kickoff to get the communication started. And we'll put those in the communication plan as we go forward. But those are some of the things you're going to want to be thinking about over the next couple of months while the contract negotiation is going on. And they'll help you get ready for the implementation. So when January rolls around and the vendor shows up, you're ready to go. And you're feeling like, hey, let's get moving on this thing. Rather than, oh dear, what do we do now? So that's what we want to do with kind of this readiness phase. All right, any questions that I can answer for you at this time? Yes?
Activity?
Sure. So the question is there any value in meeting with users and work groups ahead of time to gather information, think about design issues that might crop up? There is, but it's limited. If you have the time and the resources to do that, it can help you understand what some of the issues and bugaboos are. So if you take chart of accounts as an example, if there are known issues with the way the chart of accounts is structured, to have a meeting and gather those and document those would be a good thing. But until the vendor gets here, you're probably not going to be able to design a solution to it. So I think in terms of gathering information that would be valuable to the design process, yes. Those kinds of meetings are valuable. In terms of actually thinking about a solution, probably not yet. You should probably wait until the vendor gets here. Because the software is going to be a critical part of that, and until you know how it works and what it looks like, I'd rather have you thinking about the first part of that than the second. Yeah. So the question is, when is it a good time to assess impact or impacted departments and identify who's going to be impacted more or less by the project? And you can start doing that now. It's one of the activities that'll be in the communication plan, is to do that. And you can start that ahead of time if you're comfortable that you know the scope really well, and you should be. I mean, you're headed into contract negotiations, so we should have that. So you can start that activity any time. If you do it now, you'll need to revisit it and make sure that you keep it up to date in case there are changes between now and kickoff and then design. If you think about the implementation, it'll take a year to 2 years to do. So what the accounting function looks like today may not be what it looks like 5 months from now. I mean, we don't know. So if you do it today, that's great. You should do that. You know, assess the impact, determine which people are going to be impacted. Usually it's high, medium, low kind of thing, just in those 3 categories, so that we identify those people and we can target communications to them. But recognize that you'll want to revisit that list and make sure it's still accurate as you go through the implementation. But yeah, that is one of the things that you can start literally any time, thinking about who's impacted and coming up with that list. Anything else? Okay. If not, thank you very much for your attention, and best of luck as you go through the implementation. All right, thanks everyone.